The Mary Celeste sailed ghost-like, a perfect ship with no one aboard. Its crew vanished without a trace, leaving the Atlantic's most enduring mystery and an unthinkable human question. On December 4, 1872, out on the vast, iron-gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a speck of white canvas caught the eye of the crew aboard the British brigantine Dei Grazia. The location was roughly midway between the Azores and the coast of Portugal, a lonely expanse of sea where encountering another vessel should have been a moment of shared human comfort. Instead, as the distance closed, a profound sense of unease settled over the British sailors. The strange ship was moving erratically, her sails set awkwardly on a starboard tack, drifting aimlessly with the wind rather than cutting a deliberate path through the swells. Through his spyglass, Captain David Morehouse scanned the silent decks, expecting to see men scrambling across the rigging or a helmsman straining against the wheel. There was nothing. No hands pulled at the lines, no lookout called from the bow, and no face appeared at the rail to return his signal. The vessel was a ghost, a hollow shell of wood and canvas navigating the wilderness alone. Recognizing her lines, Morehouse realized with a jolt that this was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant ship that had departed New York weeks before him under the command of his trusted friend, Captain Benjamin Briggs. Desperate for answers and fearing a catastrophic outbreak of disease or a violent mutiny, Morehouse ordered a boarding party to lower a boat and investigate. Two experienced sailors, John DeVoe and John Wright, pulled across the choppy water, their oars breaking the eerie silence of the open ocean. As they drew alongside the towering wooden hull, they called out into the wind, but their voices were swallowed by the creaking of timber and the sloshing of waves. Clambering up the damp side of the vessel, they stepped onto a deserted deck, entering a mystery that would baffle investigators, historians, and scientists for over a century. What they found on board would challenge the boundaries of maritime logic, for the ship was not wrecked, nor was she sinking. Yet, every single soul who had sailed aboard her had completely vanished into the deep, leaving behind a puzzle that began the moment the boarding party took their first hesitant steps across the empty deck. To understand the chilling scene encountered by the boarding party, history must look backward to November 1872, in the bustling, cold port of New York. The Mary Celeste was not a legendary cursed vessel, but a hard-working, practical merchant brigantine, originally built in Nova Scotia under the name Amazon. She had recently undergone extensive refitting, lengthening her hull and expanding her cargo capacity to prepare for a demanding transatlantic run. Her captain, Benjamin Briggs, was a man of impeccable character, a deeply religious and seasoned mariner from a prominent Massachusetts seafaring family. Briggs was no reckless adventurer, he was a meticulous log keeper, a teetotaler, and a highly respected leader who prized order and safety above all else. This voyage was meant to be a routine commercial venture, carrying a heavy cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol bound for Genoa, Italy, where it would be used to fortify local wines. Because the journey was expected to be long but stable, Briggs decided to bring his family along, making the ship a temporary home. His wife, Sarah, packed her harmonium, her sewing machine, and books to pass the quiet hours at sea, while their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, filled the cabins with the bright energy of childhood. To operate the brigantine, Briggs assembled a hand-picked crew of 7 men, including his experienced first mate, Albert Richardson, and a small contingent of disciplined German sailors known for their sobriety and skill. On November 5, the lines were cast off, and the Mary Celeste glided out of New York Harbor, disappearing into the morning mist. For the first few weeks, the logbooks reveal a textbook voyage, with the ship handling the autumn Atlantic winds with predictable grace. But as November waned, the weather turned foul, forcing the small crew to battle heavy gales and hidden currents that battered the wooden hull. Yet, there was no indication in the daily records that anything was fundamentally broken, nor that the captain was losing control of his vessel. The final entry, written with a steady hand on the morning of November 25, noted their position near the island of Santa Maria in the Azores, an entirely normal location for their route. Then, the written record stops, leaving an empty space where the final chapters of the crew's lives should have been written. Stepping through the hatchways of the drifting Mary Celeste, the sailors from the Dei Grazia prepared themselves for a gruesome sight, half expecting to find a crew struck down by yellow fever or the bloody remnants of a piratical attack. Instead, the reality inside the belly of the ship was far more disorienting. The main cabins were entirely peaceful, almost as if the inhabitants had simply stepped out for a brief moment and would return at any second. In the captain's quarters, Sarah Briggs's sewing machine sat on a table, a piece of fabric still pinned beneath the needle, untouched by violence. A child's toys lay scattered on the floor, and the harmonium stood silently in the corner, its wood gleaming softly in the dim light filtering through the skylight. Pop culture legends would later manufacture wild stories of warm meals still steaming on the galley tables and half-eaten breakfasts waiting to be consumed, but the factual record paints a different, more chilling picture. There was no food on the tables, but the pantry was fully stocked with enough provisions, flour, potatoes, and fresh water to sustain the crew for 6 months. The clothing and personal belongings of the sailors were still neatly packed in their sea chests, dry and undisturbed. For a 19th-century sailor to abandon his personal gear, including his foul-weather clothing, was an act of absolute desperation, as these items were essential for survival on the ocean. The ship's papers and the captain's valuable navigational instruments, including the chronometer and the sextant, were conspicuously missing, suggesting a deliberate departure rather than a sudden abduction. The boarding party noted that the bedding was damp from the waves that had splashed through open hatches, and several inches of water swashed harmlessly in the ship's bilge, but the vessel itself was completely sound. There were no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains on the woodwork, and no evidence that anyone had died on board. The people were simply gone, leaving the material framework of their lives behind like a shell cast off on a beach, forcing the salvagers to wonder what invisible terror could cause an experienced captain to flee into the wild Atlantic. As John DeVoe combed through the structural details of the Mary Celeste, he began to notice several anomalies that pointed to a hasty, frantic evacuation rather than an orderly abandonment. The ship's single lifeboat, a small yawl that had been lashed securely across the main hatch, was entirely missing from its cradle, leaving only severed ropes trailing in the wind. The main hatch covers, which secured the dangerous cargo of industrial alcohol in the hold below, were found intact, though 2 smaller hatches had been left open, exposing the interior to the rain and spray. At the stern, the ship's wheel was spinning freely, disconnected from any human guidance, with its protective binnacle displaced and the compass inside smashed and useless. Near the bow, DeVoe discovered a long, deep gouge on the wooden rail, a strange mark that looked as though a heavy line had been pulled violently across the timber under immense strain. Most revealing of all was the state of the sails. Many had been blown out or torn by the wind, but some remained partially set, flapping uselessly against the rigging with a rhythmic, ghostly thud. The ship's pump, used to clear water from the hold, was dismantled, with its rod resting on the deck nearby, suggesting that the crew had been actively checking or repairing the mechanism before they vanished. It became clear that the departure had occurred in a rush, with no time to secure the vessel or properly prepare the lifeboat for a long voyage. The absence of the lifeboat provided a glimmer of hope that the 10 souls might still be alive, drifting somewhere in the vast Atlantic, waiting for a passing ship to spot them. Yet, the choice to leave a large, floating sanctuary for a tiny, overcrowded open boat in the middle of November was a tactical madness that defied maritime tradition. Something had fundamentally broken the spirit of Captain Briggs, convincing him that the solid timbers beneath his feet were a death trap. The salvagers knew they had to secure the vessel quickly, for the secrets of her flight were slipping away with every wave that struck her sides, raising questions that demanded a formal investigation. Recognizing the immense value of the abandoned vessel and her cargo, Captain Morehouse made a difficult decision that would shape the legal history of the Atlantic. He split his already small crew, placing First Mate DeVoe and 2 other sailors aboard the Mary Celeste with instructions to sail her to the British port of Gibraltar. For nearly a week, this skeleton crew battled fierce winds and exhaustion, guiding the wounded ghost ship through the treacherous straits and into the shadow of the Great Rock. On December 13, the Mary Celeste dropped anchor in Gibraltar, her silent arrival immediately triggering a wave of intense curiosity and suspicion among the colonial authorities. Under maritime law, the crew of the Dei Grazia were entitled to a substantial salvage award, a financial fortune representing a percentage of the total value of the ship and her cargo. However, this lucrative claim immediately drew the scrutiny of the British Admiralty Court, led by a strict, suspicious Attorney General named Frederick Sollyflood. Sollyflood looked at the salvage claim not as a tale of heroic seamanship, but as a potential cover-up for a dark and highly lucrative maritime crime. He found it impossible to believe that an experienced captain like Briggs would willingly walk away from a perfectly seaworthy ship without a sinister reason. The court ordered a comprehensive forensic examination of the vessel, bringing in naval surveyors to examine every inch of the hull, searching for signs of foul play. The investigation quickly turned adversarial, as the British officials subjected the American salvagers to intense, aggressive cross-examinations, implying they knew more about the disappearance than they were letting on. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick with tension, as the legal battle shifted from a simple salvage hearing into a de facto murder investigation. The world watched through newspaper headlines as the court dug into the logs, looking for any shred of evidence that could transform this bizarre mystery into a concrete crime, setting the stage for a series of wild accusations that would taint the case for generations. As the Gibraltar inquiry dragged on into the early months of 1873, Frederick Sollyflood became convinced that he was dealing with a case of cold-blooded murder on the high seas. He focused heavily on a report from a naval surveyor who claimed to have found faint, dark stains on the deck timbers and a sharp cut on the captain's ceremonial sword, which was found under his bed. Sollyflood spun a dramatic theory of mutiny, suggesting that the German crew members had broken into the cargo, consumed the alcohol, and murdered Captain Briggs, his family, and the first mate in a drunken rage. According to this dark hypothesis, the mutineers had then fled in the lifeboat or had been lost at sea after abandoning the vessel, leaving the ship clean of any incriminating evidence. This sensational theory filled the international press, transforming the tragic disappearance into a lurid tale of violence, greed, and betrayal that captured the public imagination. However, the factual evidence soon tore Sollyflood's narrative apart, exposing the dangers of jumping to conclusions without scientific backing. A rigorous chemical analysis of the stains on the deck revealed that they were not blood at all, but a harmless mixture of iron rust and spilled boot polish. Furthermore, the cargo of industrial alcohol was completely unpotable. It was pure, poisonous spirit that no sailor could drink without suffering immediate illness or blindness. The crew members themselves had reputations for absolute reliability and had no history of violence or insubordination that would suggest a sudden, murderous uprising. When Captain Morehouse and his men were finally cleared of complicity, the court awarded them only a fraction of the salvage money, a bitter prize for a rescue that had cost them their peace of mind. The mutiny theory died in the courtroom, but its collapse left an even deeper, more unsettling void in the investigation. If human malice had not emptied the decks of the Mary Celeste, then the answer had to lie within the volatile forces of nature or the hidden mechanics of the ship itself, waiting to be decoded. With the official inquiry ending in an inconclusive verdict of unknown causes, the empty space left by the facts was quickly filled by Victorian fiction and urban legends. The most influential of these myths emerged in 1884, when a young, unknown doctor named Arthur Conan Doyle published a short story titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. Doyle took the basic framework of the Mary Celeste mystery, altered the name of the ship to the Marie Celeste, and introduced a sensational plot involving a vengeful ex-slave who murdered the crew one by one. The story was written so realistically that many readers mistook it for an actual historical confession, permanently embedding false details into the public consciousness. Suddenly, the world believed the ship had been found with half-eaten meals on the tables, warm tea in the cups, and a cat sleeping peacefully in the galley, details that were entirely fabricated by Doyle's creative imagination. Other writers added increasingly bizarre elements, claiming that all the lifeboats were still on board, or that the crew had been abducted by a giant squid or swept away by a sudden, localized plague. These sensationalized myths effectively buried the real historical record, making it difficult for future researchers to separate the genuine evidence from the literary ghosts. The fictionalized Mary Celeste became the archetype of the ghost ship, a symbol of supernatural abduction that overshadowed the real, human tragedy of the Briggs family. In reality, the true evidence collected by DeVoe and Morehouse was far more subtle and mechanical than any monster or ghost story could provide. By stripping away the Victorian folklore, modern investigators began to look closely at the physical realities of the voyage, focusing on the dark, volatile cargo resting in the hold. The answers were not to be found in the supernatural, but in a terrifying, invisible reaction that occurred beneath the decks, a silent danger that the captain could not see but could certainly smell. Among the credible scientific explanations developed in the modern era, the theory of an industrial alcohol-chemical reaction stands as one of the most compelling and terrifying. When the Mary Celeste was finally unloaded in Genoa, investigators discovered that 9 of the 1,701 wooden barrels of alcohol were completely empty, their contents having leaked into the hold. These barrels had been made of red oak, a porous wood that is far more prone to leaking than the white oak barrels typically used for transporting spirits. As the ship battled the heavy gales and temperature fluctuations of the mid-Atlantic, the leaked alcohol would have vaporized quickly in the unventilated, enclosed space of the hold. This created a highly volatile, invisible cloud of gas that accumulated over several weeks, turning the belly of the ship into a ticking chemical bomb. A modern simulation conducted by scientists at University College London demonstrated that a small spark, perhaps caused by the friction of iron hoops rubbing together in the rough sea, could have ignited these fumes. This would have triggered a sudden, dramatic flash explosion, a blast of pressure and blue flame that would rip through the hold without leaving behind scorch marks or serious structural damage. To Captain Briggs, standing on the deck above, a sudden blast from the hatches followed by a rush of foul, intoxicating gas would have sounded like the death knell of his ship. Believing that a secondary, catastrophic explosion was imminent and that his cargo was about to detonate beneath his family's feet, he would have faced an agonizing decision. In a state of absolute panic, he would have ordered an immediate evacuation, prioritizing the lives of his wife and child over the preservation of his ship. The invisible blast would have cleared almost instantly, leaving the ship completely unharmed, but the psychological damage was already done. The crew was now trapped in a fragile open boat, watching from a distance as the vessel they had just abandoned drifted away from them into the gathering gloom of the Atlantic afternoon. While the alcohol explosion theory offers a psychological trigger for the panic, another factual explanation looks closely at the mechanical failures that plagued the Mary Celeste's final days. Documented historical records show that the ship had recently been carrying a cargo of coal on her previous voyage, an operation that left behind a massive amount of fine, black coal dust in the bilge. During the heavy refitting in New York, this residue was not entirely cleared out, remaining hidden beneath the ship's internal timbers. When the autumn gales struck the ship in late November, the constant, violent rolling of the vessel would have washed this loose coal dust directly into the ship's bilge pumps. The thick, abrasive sludge would have choked the valves and internal mechanisms, rendering the primary pumps completely useless and preventing the crew from clearing normal water accumulation. Crucially, on the morning of the abandonment, the ship's pump was found entirely dismantled on the deck, proving that First Mate Richardson was actively trying to fix a critical mechanical failure. Without a working pump, Captain Briggs had no accurate way of knowing how much water was actually invading his ship, as the rough seas made visual inspection deceptive. To complicate matters, the Mary Celeste had changed ownership and design, meaning her internal measuring systems might have given a false reading to a captain unfamiliar with her new architecture. If a sounding rod showed several feet of water due to a clogged channel or a misread scale, Briggs would have believed his vessel was actively sinking beneath him. Surrounded by heavy rain, dark skies, and a failing pump, he would have concluded that his time on the brigantine had run out. The decision to abandon ship was not an act of madness, but a rational response to a catastrophic combination of false data and mechanical failure, forcing them into the lifeline. The final puzzle piece of the Mary Celeste mystery lies not in why they left, but in why they were never able to return to their floating sanctuary. The factual evidence strongly suggests that Captain Briggs did not intend to permanently abandon his ship, but rather to wait out the perceived danger from a safe distance. He would have ordered the crew into the small yawl, keeping the family close, while trailing behind the Mary Celeste at the end of a long, heavy towline. This strategy allowed them to remain attached to the larger vessel while ensuring they were safe from any immediate explosion or sudden sinking, ready to reboard if the ship remained stable. This theory perfectly explains the deep gouge found on the ship's wooden rail, where a heavy hawser rope would have been rubbed violently against the wood under the weight of the towed boat. However, this defensive strategy relied on absolute control over a volatile, unpredictable ocean environment. As they trailed behind, a sudden, violent squall or a shift in the wind could have caught the Mary Celeste's remaining sails, causing the large brigantine to surge forward with immense, unstoppable momentum. The sudden tension on the towline would have been catastrophic, snapping the thick rope like twine or dragging the small, overloaded yawl violently through the rough waters. Alternatively, in a moment of panic as the line threatened to pull the small boat under, someone may have been forced to cut the rope with an axe, severing their only link to survival. Once detached, the heavy Mary Celeste, with her sails partially set, would have glided away into the mist, moving faster than the men could row. The 10 souls in the open boat would have watched in absolute horror as their giant, warm home vanished into the gray horizon, leaving them completely alone in the freezing, mid-Atlantic night without supplies or shelter. Ultimately, the tragedy of the Mary Celeste is not a story of supernatural monsters or romantic ghost tales, but a sobering reminder of the fragile margin of human survival on the open ocean. It demonstrates how a chain of minor, individual failures, porous wooden barrels, a clogged pump, a sudden change in weather, and a moment of human miscalculation, can combine to create a catastrophic disaster. Captain Benjamin Briggs did not fail because he was incompetent. He failed because the sea leaves no room for error, and because a captain must make split-second decisions with imperfect information. The true horror of the Mary Celeste is found in her absolute mundane reality. She was a solid, working ship that outlived her crew simply because she was too heavy to sink, while the humans who built her were swallowed by the waves. The case reminds us that the ocean remains an alien, indifferent wilderness that does not care about human ambition, family bonds, or industrial progress. Over a century later, the names of those 10 souls remain etched in maritime history, their final moments forever hidden beneath the shifting, unreadable currents of the Atlantic. The Mary Celeste herself was eventually sold, passing through several owners before being deliberately wrecked for insurance fraud off the coast of Haiti, as if her wooden heart refused to carry the burden of her reputation any longer. Her story survives because it touches a deep, fundamental human fear, the terror of vanishing without a trace, of leaving behind a silent room where our voices used to be. As we look back at the empty deck and the spinning wheel, we realize that the greatest mystery is not what took the crew, but how quickly the traces of our lives can be erased by the wind and the rain. Before you go, here's the thing. Every week we investigate another mystery the world could never solve. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And here's the most important part. The next case we investigate could be yours. Tell us in the comments which unsolved mystery, disappearance, or disaster we should cover next. We read every suggestion, and the stories that stay with you are the ones we bring to life.